Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Part two of the problem series. And there are only going to be three parts because I just don't want to go too much of this. I just think it's, like I said, it makes me slightly uncomfortable, but I did want to do these two and then the third one, which will be different again. But tonight I wanted to do the problem with Malcolm Gladwell. This is pretty easy to summarize. Malcolm Gladwell is absolutely one of America's great fiction writers. He tells stories that people love to hear. They enjoy reading his books. He sells millions of copies of them. His narratives are compelling and interesting, and people embrace them and they feel uplifted and informed by them, which is really the goal, I think, of any great fiction writer in some ways. Entertaining, uplifting, informational, easy to read, large audience. I mean, it's hard to argue with any of that, except the slight problem is they keep putting his books in the non-fiction section. And this is where you run into trouble. Is Gladwell is telling these great stories, but they're really stories, and they aren't, they're just not nonfiction. They're fiction, and that's roughly the way to summarize the best way to understand what Gladwell is up to. And I just want to look at three works, three of his most popular works. I didn't just pick and randomly pick the most popular ones here, and I'll start with Blink, and then I'll move on to Connections and finish with Outliers. But I'll spend the most time with Blink because I think it establishes the patterns. I think you could do this with any of his works, but I think Blink is the one I know best for establishing the patterns that he uses, and you really get a sense of how his arguments progress. And what you see is, a heavy use of anecdotal evidence strung together to make a compelling narrative to tell us a story that generally we like to hear. And so great stories that tell us things we like to know makes us feel good, and so we enjoy them. And again, unfortunately, the only bad part about it is generally they have little or no merit. So, for instance, in Blink, not Blank, Blink, Malcolm Gladwell argues that there's all this power in appealing to our intuition, and just the blink, the not thinking, just deciding, going with your intuition, going with your gut, going with your feelings. And he doesn't oversell this. He doesn't say, oh, that's the only thing you can do. But he does say, look, there's this incredibly powerful force. Go with your intuition, go with what you know. And he gives all kinds of examples of this, of where, our thinking has helped. We gain advantages from Blink, the power of not thinking. This is a bit fraught, of course. And one of the main examples he uses is that during the Getty was going to buy, the J. Paul Getty Museum was going to buy a statue, a Greek statue of great antiquity, and it was hugely expensive, but would have added a huge deal of prestige also to the J. Paul Getty Museum. And so they had it tested by a scientist, and he had said, yeah, it looks like it verifies for age. And the scientist had published an article, I believe, in Scientific American about the tests and how he'd run them, and why it suggested that the statue was real and a true antiquity and not a fake. But then, as the story goes, they brought in these two art critics. They pulled the cover off the statue in front of them, and in just moments, they looked at it, the two experts, and they just knew it was a fake. They just pointed to it and said, look, this is a fake. And I'm quoting from the book now. It says, in the first 2 seconds of looking, in a single glance, they, the critics, were able to understand more about the essence of the statue than the team at the Getty was able to understand after 14 months. And so, boom, there it is. The intuitive arguments, feelings triumph over all that careful study and scientific research, so on and so forth. And then, of course, they didn't buy the statue, and it did turn out that, in fact, it was it turned out to be a forgery. It was actually a very good forgery, but it wasn't an actual real statue. So there you go. The power of the intuition of these art critics triumphs. Now, the problems here are manifold. One, trusting art critics to choose what goes into your museums based on their guts. If you know anything about art history and about museum art collections, this is a problematic, let us say, argument to make, because numerous Ming vases have been found to be forgeries. In fact, there's a lot of museums won't allow their Mings to be tested because they don't want to know, right? They just want to say that they're real, and they don't want to know whether or not they really are real, because their art critics had decided that they were real and that was good enough for them. The whole history of Vermeer as a painter, just, you can go on and on about this with Vermeer. Are there any Vermeer paintings? How many? Which ones are real? Oh my goodness. It goes on and on. So the notion that museums should just take a couple of critics and go, okay, whatever your gut tells you, hey, let's roll with that, and that'll be good because you guys have got the intuition. Of course, another problem with this is you have the problem, of course, then how do you pick the art critics, right? If it's the intuition of the art critics that's going to make the difference in whether or not you buy a multi-million-dollar piece of art, then what is the criteria used for art? The ones you like, right? My gut tells me that I like this art critic. She looks savvy. She looks like she's got a good gut. Let's go with her. He looks like he's got what would that mean, right? How would you then, because of course choosing the critic is going to be the most important part. Another part of this problem is it acts as an attack on science, because the anecdote suggests that the scientist, whose name was Margolis, that somehow he did something wrong. And as again, quoting from the book, Margolis spent 2 days examining the surface of the statue with a high-resolution stereo microscope, removed core samples measuring 1 centimeter in diameter and 2 centimeters in length, and analyzed using an electron microscope, X-ray diffraction, X-ray fluorescence. His conclusion: state was old and was not a contemporary fake. So there's the idea. So Margolis spent all this time and days and using high-tech stuff, but his conclusions were wrong. The science was wrong. The intuition was right. Don't trust all those scientists. There's, all that science and study, that's just going to mislead you. Now, it's very weird for someone like Gladwell to make what looks like a really strong anti-scientific argument. But it, along with the problem of just saying, okay, what art critic do you choose? He never answers or really defines what did Margolis say that was wrong. Where did he go wrong? What one of his measurements should have caught the error that didn't? Or did Margolis say, look, here's the studies I run, and the forger maybe knew the studies that were going to be run, and so created something that would trick all those studies, in which case Margolis's studies were all accurate. It's just that his studies were all misled, right? So this is a different quantity or quality of error than if there was something that he had done that was wrong. And so, you really need to talk about, okay, did he make a measurement error? This is not huge. Was this instruments misled purposefully by the forgery? So that would mean the forgery is great. Margolis isn't wrong. And finally, the entire structure of the anecdote is false. So it turns out that the critics didn't go, oh, it's a fake, and so we're not going to buy it. The critics said, oh, it's a fake. Their own art critics inside the Getty had already been studying it and were concerned, which is why they brought in the outside scientist and the outside art critic. And then they had actually brought in more critics and did more studying and analyzing. So this was not a triumph of intuition over science or study or careful evaluation or time. It was the internal people had looked at it and said, we've got questions, we've got concerns, we hope it's real. Let's bring in some more people. They ran some tests. The tests looked positive. They brought in some critics. The critics didn't seem so positive. So they brought in more people to do more studies. And then they made their decision. So it was many people over a long period of time doing lots of different kinds of careful analysis and study, the results of which created a cumulative decision based on lots of evidence and lots of careful thinking over long periods of time involving dozens of people. It's the opposite of intuition, right? The absolute polar opposite from what he was presenting. So the narrative that he presents in the book is actually either unrepresentative or completely misleading about how the decisions were actually reached and what the Getty people were doing. Because the Getty people were not insane. They didn't just call in two people and say, whatever you say, that's good enough for us, and we're going to spend, whatever, a couple of $10-50 million pursuing something on that basis. No, they're being very careful, very step by step in their process, and they got a good result based on that process, which was, again, the opposite of intuitive analysis. And if this was the only time that this happened, then that would be okay, one little misleading. But Gladwell consistently creates anecdotal narratives that, just an anecdote, by the way, can mislead you. It's the problem that's the problem with anecdotes, is they're little stories, and the question is, are they applicable or not applicable? So that's one question. But when the stories themselves and the way they're presented don't even represent the anecdote, right? The little story itself is not accurate. Well, now you're really in trouble. And this is a consistent pattern in Gladwell, that he often tells stories that don't actually mimic the truth of what he's articulating, the narrative that he's presenting. And so the story is very appealing, it's very cogent, it's very pointed, and it's not very representative of what's going on. A second example that you get from Blink is the case study of Kenna's Dilemma in there, which is the story of this young musician that some other famous musicians really love. The manager and industry insiders all think, wow, he's going to be great. But they're like, wow, he does so poorly in focus groups, is that the radio stations don't want to carry him. And the notion is that, wow, look, if all these industry insiders, I think Bono was one of them, if they all want him to do well, and they all think he's a great musician, then certainly the radio station should be playing him. And if they knew what they were doing, they would give airtime to an artist like Kenna. The managers, musicians, and talent scouts immediately knew he was good. This is what the book says. And the radio stations and the public are missing out because the radio stations don't go with their gut. They go with, focus groups and then all this kind of things. And so, again, it creates this notion of a false dilemma, where it's like either this great musician that all these people's intuitions say are great gets promoted, or the radio stations and the record, companies and everything are wrong. There's your choices. Of course, this is of course completely unrepresentative of the possibilities in this case. Now, one possibility is that he's a musician's musician. There's such a thing as a writer's writer. It's writers that other writers really love. They might never sell a lot of books, but other writers go, oh, this writer is really great. Same thing with musicians. There's some musicians, some performers that other performers think are really great. They're just always referring to them, think they're awesome, but they never perhaps break through to the popular imagination because it's a different audience. The other notion is that while he might be a great musician, the radio stations could be perfectly accurate in going, you know what, he is not going to sell a lot of records. A lot of great musicians don't sell a lot of records, but radio stations are really interested in what's popular and what they can make advertising revenue from. And so it's not a stretch. It's not that radio stations are never wrong. They're often wrong, but it just doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. And he provides no evidence, by the way, that that these other possibilities exist, that, oh, maybe he's just not the kind of person that lots of people are ever going to like. Even though if Kenna was the kind of musician that lots of people were going to like, why wouldn't he have generated more interest? Why couldn't he do more concerts? Why couldn't Bono just have him as an opening act and promote him, right? All these other possibilities are out there. But the notion is, well, the focus groups and the studying and this kind of critical analysis does not produce good results. Intuition, magic insight, the people who know, that's what produces good results. So, trust your intuition, trust your gut. Again, so this is, if this were a book on New Age mystics or anti-science religious fundamentalists, it would not be that, would be pretty middle of the road and pretty tame. But it tends to sort of pretend to be doing a rational discourse while often undermining all the rules of rational discourse and use of evidence and presenting fair logic and these sorts of things. And so it's very concerning. And rather than, although again, Gladwell does mention this, it's lost in the overall arc. It's pretty clear, the studies in this show, the reason you want to trust an arts critic's intuition is because it is the result of years and years of careful study and evaluation and reflection. This is why their intuition might be good. Their intuition is a reflection not of magic or of some, deep emotional capacity. It is the refined sensitivity of someone who has practiced or studied or looked for years. And so when you're training people, when you're preparing people to do something, part of what you're doing is trying to create habits of thought or insight, or with athletes, it's of movement where they don't have to think. They can just respond instantaneously. But it's not because that thinking is bad. It's not because thinking misleads you. It's because highly trained, highly refined thinking produces intuitions that are correct often, and that you can rely on when you have time pressures. Athletes often have time pressures. Art critics generally don't have time pressures. So it's good for them to have their intuitions, but then they do just what the Getty did, which is to follow up on their intuition with more careful study, more evidence, more analysis. And to suggest otherwise is simply totally and grossly inaccurate. And this is, like I said, this is the core problem that you see repeatedly in Gladwell's work. So just to give two more examples, one of them, let's go the tipping point. And it talks about, basically it's this notion, which is not entirely incorrect again, but it is this notion that, hey, small percentages of actions or of actors can have outside effects, right? That they have much more effect than you might think. And this is certainly, true in some instances. But several of the claims that he's made in Tipping Point turned out to be either very dubious or of suspect provenance. And one of them is, he said, social movements or social ideas or social patterns spread quickly, in part because there's these special people called connectors. And the special power of the connectors is that they connect to lots and lots more people than a regular person does. And so if something hits a connector, that connector will act like an amplifier, right? They won't spread it to one or two or three other people. They'll spread the idea or the song or the recipe to 10,000 other people or 100 other people. And so it has this multiplier effect. And so this relatively small group of well-connected people, and connection, of course, in this environment relates to, the specific notion, like someone who's well-connected in the music industry, or somebody who's well-connected in fashion, or someone who's well-connected in crime studies, or whatever the subject is. And so those connectors then have this, outsized influence, and they accelerate that. They accelerate the impact. And even though they're a small group, they have a very large impact, and hence they tend to inflect these tipping points where suddenly small changes make very big differences. Now, he based this on a study, and again, this is the problem with social science, is there's a lot of single studies in social science, and they have what they call the replication crisis. I mentioned this before, where many of these famous studies, when they try to replicate them, they do not get the same results, or they get different results, or they can't just be verified. The original study is too weak to actually hold up under the scrutiny of careful analysis. And so it is actually called the verification or replication crisis in social science now, because it's such a widespread problem. Well, one of the studies that he used was, it wasn't a terrible study, but it was very small, right? It was a very small, I think it was just like 100 people that were used in this study, which is not necessarily to criticize the study, but when you're trying to do large dynamics, large groups, 100 may not be very many. The sampling problem. Hey, we would love to sample 1 million people, but we don't have the resource to do it, so we're going to do 100. The question is 100 people significantly large enough sample to give you validity? In this case, probably not. Anyway, when that study was replicated with larger numbers and more carefully controlled environment, what they found is connectors may not be actually a thing. And again, it's just not, I don't mean to criticize Gladwell in this case, because he was using a study, but he just presents like, okay, here's one study, they did this one study, boom, there we go, there we know. This is completely unacceptable in science. I mean, in science, you need replica in theory, right? Of course, in practice, your mileage may vary, but the idea is you're supposed to have overwhelming evidence, you're supposed to have large sample sizes, you're supposed to have replication, you're supposed to have confidence within the community that these results are valid. But Gladwell and many other people like Gladwell, which is why I'm using Gladwell as an example, because it's not just about Gladwell. These are patterns that you see throughout these sort of soft argument books is, here's one study, whatever that one study concludes, that is written in stone tablets. It says, this is gravity. This is, it's an undeniably perfectly calibrated, totally insightful moment, and we can draw incredible conclusions from that. In social sciences, this is essentially never true. I mean, the studies tend to be difficult. It's hard to isolate variables in the social sciences. It's really hard to control for the variables. So you'd like to have huge sample sizes, but that tends to produce other problems, not least of which is cost and time, and so on and so forth. So social science experiments tend to be relatively weak, and they tend to be, you need to be very judicious in your presentation of the value of the results. And writers like Gladwell tend to be very injudicious in their presentation of the results. So that study itself turned out to be, not relatively very strong, and his conclusion was dubious even at the time. But then he goes to the next step, and this is back to the anecdotes notion. And he uses this crazy anecdote about hush puppies. And he says hush puppies were these shoes that were completely out of fashion. They'd been okay for a while, but now they're, almost gone. But then a few, trendy people, I think in New York, started wearing them. And just these few fashion guys wearing them, all of a sudden, then through the connectors and all the people went, ooh, we want to wear hush puppies again. And all of a sudden, boom, there was this big boom in hush puppy sales. And it's like, great, there you go. I'm probably sure that's more or less that's a fair anecdote. Now, great. Hush puppy sales. So this is fashion. So the question to ask is the world of fashion representative of the function of other elements of our society? Because another relevant story he talks about is crime in New York City and this very powerful drop in crime in New York City. And he says it basically works like hush puppies. Like there are these few small changes were made. They got rid of graffiti in the subways and they stopped people from skipping fares. And then suddenly the crime rate dropped because the small group of people that you influenced, they had this outside effect and they spread through it like the hush puppies. And there you go. Small changes lead to drastic results like the reduction in crime in New York. It's pretty well documented now that this is not true, that the called the broken window theory is not really a very good theory for stopping or preventing crime. Not that it's a bad idea to have nice places to live and not have broken windows or graffiti everywhere, although many of those graffiti artists now, they're doing some nice work. But it just turns out that the science and the documentation does not support this conclusion. Second, again, is the question, does the rest of the world function like fashion, where a few really hugely influential people can indeed cause certain fashions to suddenly catch on? Now, they can't do this invariably, of course, because then the fashion industry wouldn't function very well, but they do have outside influence, and you can see certain trends catch on and they spread. But is this how everything works? And as far as I can tell, Gladwell provides no evidence that this is the case. So you would have to argue that fashion is hugely representative of any social phenomenon. And there's just, like I said, there's just not a lot of evidence of this. And you can think of many counterexamples. One of which I like, which is they say in architecture that it takes at least apparently like 50 years for some sort of new building technology or technique to really roll out into general acceptance in the building community, because the building community is very conservative, very expensive, lots of lead time, lots of construction restrictions, lots of training issues, lots of legacy, right? A lot of people have been doing it for 30 years. To adopt something new takes a lot of time. And so, it's a slow, right? So you're sort of trickling things out, and you're really having to push to get even clearly superior the technology or the modes of building adopted, even when they're often, maybe cheaper or faster or more environmentally friendly. It just takes a long time to get an industry to shift. And I can assure you that one person or one influential builder or something, or one article in Home Design magazine or something is not going to suddenly cause a shift in the industry. It's an industry that adopts very slowly and under really different conditions. So this is just a counterexample off the top of my head. And I'm sure you guys can think of more out there if you stop and ponder and go, oh, how about, piano design, right? There's been a few slight changes. There's Fazioli, is that the newish piano company, last 20 years, I think, has come on and doing some high-end pianos. But Steinway's been, making Steinways, Yamaha, it's very slight changes, right? It's why they were set where they were, how Steinway got market dominance, and it's an interesting question, certainly interesting to explore. But I don't think a few influential people changing to use different pianos at this moment would suddenly dramatically alter the landscape of the grand piano market. I mean, it's, Yamaha shifted and gained some ground, but the pianos are not that different, and the market, is pretty stable, well established. So anyway, when you hear these anecdotes and hear them applied broadly, the question is, wow, are hush puppy shoes and fashion issues really similar to social issues like crime and, let's say, homelessness, right? It would be great to think we could solve homelessness by getting a few people to do something that would then have this outside effect and suddenly transform everything. And wow, it would be great. But I'm dubious. And finally is the famous Outliers. And generally people pick on Outliers because of the 10,000 hour rule, which Gladwell presents as part of his argument. He says, look, where do we get these people who are statistically extreme? The Bill Gates or the Steve Jobs or the Beatles, or he uses these examples of these really famous outlier people. And he says, where do they come from? And he says, part of it is luck, right? You have to be in the right environment, which makes perfect sense. And he says, part of it is talent. Of course, talent is important, but he says a big part of it is 10,000 hours of practice. And he cites a study whose authors who came out and said, no, this is not what our study does not suggest this. We never said the 10,000 hours was a thing, but everybody picked up on 10,000 hours because it's such a great story. It's the idea that, if you work for 10,000 hours, then you can go from being, competent to being a master or something like this. You can really, get to the next level. And it became this kind of meme that everybody was pulling out of Gladwell's book, because this is exactly how Gladwell presents it. The problems here are manifest. There's other parts of the book that are troubling as well. But one part that's really important is that truly there's no evidence to suggest 10,000 hours is a magic number in any way about any subject. Some things you can master much more quickly than 10,000 hours. Some things, 10,000 hours, you're not going to be done mastering them. I'm thinking of like famous mathematicians. They just never, they ever master the field. They just keep working, right? Euler was a genius before he had done 10,000 hours. He was a genius after he had done 10,000 hours. Did he ever stop geniusing? I don't know. I don't know how much any of those hours changed him. He just seemed to be producing Gauss. They just seemed to be producing brilliant mathematics just in an unending stream, regardless of how much time they had or had not been working on it. And you can think of, these examples in every direction. So one is, it's silly because it just, as soon as you start thinking of counterexamples, of course, you kind of go, oh yeah, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But it appeals to our notion of, sort of hard work, and, if you're dedicated, you can get ahead, and, it's all not just about talent and luck, which it certainly isn't, by the way, but talent and luck never hurt. The other notion is the whole talent, luck, hard work, right environment notion. This becomes complex and not simple at all. I mean, and one way to read that book, despite what his narrative is to say, yeah, outlier. It's hard to explain outliers because there's so many variables that you don't really ever know. So I always like to use football as an example because I love football. But you can go, coaches always say, "Wow, you can't coach speed." Right? It's one of the things you just can't coach speed, or you can't coach up players to flip their hips. Like defensive backs do this weird running backwards thing, and then they have to rotate their hips. And I was talking to a coach who did this, and he said, I've never met a player that I could coach up. Either they could do it or they can't do it. If they can do it, I can help them do it better. If they can't do it, it just, they can't, it's just, you can't train them. But apparently it just is or an isn't. And you can't coach speed. You can improve it a little bit, maybe, but you can't coach it. But speed isn't enough, of course. Otherwise, it would just be all the fastest players. But if you look at an NFL team, because it has such a diversity of talents that you need big old huge strong guys on the line, you need fast guys, you need smart guys, you need receivers, and you have all these different talent pools that you need to build a team. Pain tolerance, of course, there's a great one. And some of it's going to be raw talent, some of it's going to be lots of hard work. But if you can work as hard as you want, if you're 5'4" and 200 pounds, you're not going to be a lineman. I mean, you might be able to play some other position, but you're not going to be a lineman. It's just impossible, right? And that, so when you think about the variability of opportunities in every field, you realize that the mix of luck and talent and skill is just so diverse that it's probably not reducible to any single formula. And to suggest that it is, and it's certainly not 10,000 hours, that there is any simple conclusion to how outliers occur, is probably the correct result, because there's just so many different fields in which people can be outliers, and there's so many different ways in which outlying can take place. You might just be so ridiculously, absurdly more talented than everybody that nothing else really matters. But other times, environment and luck and other things probably matter a lot. And certainly practice helps a lot of people in a lot of cases become superior at what they're doing. So, and more, right? These are not the only ones. Privilege, right? Having the means to participate. And then also the notion of, and then I'll knock off on this one, is to do 10,000 hours takes a certain amount of dedication, or whatever the word, grit or grind, well, is that an innate capacity or a learned capacity? Right? If I'm innately the kind of person who's dedicated to pursuing specific goals, then that really helps. But this is a talent, not something that's developed. Or is it something that's developed? By the way, this is a debate in the psychological community. This is one of those questions. But, saying 10,000 hours of work, then you have to ask, well, why would somebody put in 10,000 hours when somebody else wouldn't? Is that just the other people are lazy and those people are good? Or is it like, oh, no, you could have a talent for sort of, you enjoy it, or you're drawn to it, or you have the drive to do it. Where does drive come from, right? Is it an innate thing, or is it a learned thing, or is it a mix of innate capacities in the environment? So again, he takes a complex, rich, and sort of narrows it down into a simple narrative based on little or misleading evidence, and draws, dubious conclusions, or at least creates a narrative that invites us to feel good about the sort of hard work and opportunity mixing together to create extraordinary genius. And on outliers as well, actually, this is, back to the Peterson one, this is something Peterson does as well. Is he has this great point, which is an accurate point, by the way, that when you have extreme results, or unfair results, you have a distribution of extremes, right? Which is kind of what the outliers idea is. So if you have a field like, say, engineering that's dominated by men, say 80% men and 20% women, just because you have the outlier extreme result does not mean necessarily that's the result of, say, discrimination in this case, or other other problems. And this is true, of course. It may not be the case, although it also may be the case that it's a result of discrimination or other forces, right? And when you oversimplify, when you say, oh, well, here's one or two or three variables, those are the only ones that matter, generally one, maybe two at most, and then now we know the answer again, then it's easy to explain outliers. 10,000 hours of work, a little luck, a little magic opportunity, boom, there you go. Maybe a little talent might be helpful too, but mostly it's just the work and the opportunity, and then everybody's greatness will rise to the top. There's very little evidence that this is true at all. And again, I only belabor these points because they're representative of patterns that we see in many, many works in the media, in society generally, that suggest that oversimplification and pleasing anecdotal narratives that appeal to us in some way equal truth or equal insight. Unfortunately, this is not the case, but it is misleading. Gladwell has sold millions and millions of books on his capacity, which, by the way, is admirable. He tells a great story. He really is. It is the power of great writing. I mean, he shouldn't have written a book on Blink. He should have written a book on writing, because he does have this really great gift for coordinating ideas and laying out a narrative that makes them appealing. And in many ways, he's set the model. He was so successful that he set a model that lots of other authors unfortunately follow. So in a way, he's a little like Kant, and that Kant did the reverse. He had such great ideas and such bad style that everybody copied Kant's style without his ideas, and ruined everybody's style. In Gladwell's case, he has such great style mixed with such terrible ideas that everybody copies the delivery, right? They're like, ooh, I want that great clean style, and they don't care about the ideas, right? They just say, well, whatever fits that beautiful narrative and creates the story. Publishers love it, readers eat it up, and everybody feels like they're being enlightened. But again, you see a similar pattern as to what you're seeing in Peterson, which is an interesting, pleasing narrative or a simple solution. Hey, just because you have divergent outcomes, where either more women than men or more men than women, doesn't mean there's discrimination, which is true. But then you need to ask the question, well, where does this come from? And then if the answer is generally this attempt to super simplify 10,000 hours, or here's a study that suggests something, then you're probably on the wrong track. So for the next one and the last one in this series, what I do want to focus on is a few strategies or a few ways of reading and thinking that might be helpful in avoiding these and raising questions about things that I say or things you read, but in a way that's not too disturbing, because I recognize it is difficult sometimes to go, oh, I'm reading something, I don't know if this is true. Do I stop and check the source? How do you go about sort of trying to be careful when you're taking in information and trying to look for insight and trying to learn with the sources and the material, so that you aren't misled? And by the way, I've been misled. I've gotten the quotes wrong. I've read arguments that seemed really strong. One of my favorite writers, Daniel Kahneman, because of, again, the replication problem in the social sciences, he had to retract a bunch of his work because some of his studies were based on other people's works and his argument that turned out to be false. And so he's like, wow, I feel like I've misled people, and he's had to go back and try to fix that. So it's tricky. I don't want to suggest that this is some sort of simple, straightforward thing. So for my third one in the problem series, I want to talk about how to, or maybe to just suggest some ways that we can approach these sort of challenges and try to get the good stuff out and avoid some of the pitfalls. So the problem with Malcolm Gladwell, very simply, he's a great fiction writer who's somehow been misclassified in the nonfiction section. Thank you.